Hey gang, East Coast Lumberjack here. And today we're going to talk about checks, drying checks, splits, that kind of thing in the ends of handles, okay? What's to worry about and what isn't. All right, so that's today's video. If you haven't subscribed to my channel yet, be sure you do. So what we're going to talk about, when you make an axe handle, okay, like these ones here, like the one here on my bench. I'll pull you down here a little bit so you can see. Okay. So I'm working away here on this handle. It's a hickory handle, and it's got a big flare down here. Okay, really nice, man. Talk about a beautiful feeling handle in your hand. And this whole order is like that. Okay, it's got really pronounced flares in the palm swells. Okay, here's another one for this order. Look at that one. Okay, very substantial palm swells. Now, if you don't want wood checks, okay, wood checks, that's what it does. So when it's drying, the wood's coming out, and what happens is the moisture is filling up all those cells in your axe handle wood. And then as the wood dries and that moisture leaves the cells shrink a little bit, okay? And once you get a bunch of cells shrink, eventually there's going to be a split because they fill up a certain volume. And again, once you take the moisture out of that, you're going to get little cracks where they pull together, okay? So it's shrinking, it's getting smaller. And the overall wood size gets a little bit smaller, but what happens is it also shrinks in the middle of the wood, and where it shrinks a lot in two different directions, so it pulls one way, pulls the other, that's where that split comes in, okay? Or what we call a drying check, okay? They're called checks. And if you look at the ends of wood, and let me see if I can find you a good example here in my pile. I know where there's a good one. Right here. Okay. So, I know this is a good example because it's very dense wood. The other thing I'll say about drying checks and splits and stuff in wood is the denser the wood, the larger they are. All right. Now, we get a lot of this when we go to lumberjack shows and we're cutting those big round cookies off at the Steel Timber Sports Series. And people will spray, their spray paint on the end of them, Steel Timber Sports or Big Green Egg, whatever. And then they give them out to the crowd, okay? And people love to take those home as a souvenir. And you put that big round disc on your wall, and what happens? What happens after a month or two? You take it from the outside, you bring it into your house where your relative humidity is probably down around 15–20%, and all of a sudden that round disc gets a big split right in it, okay? And the same thing is happening in that disc that's happening in our drying wood, okay? The water's leaving the cells, they're shrinking up a little bit, they pull in two different directions, and all of a sudden the wood breaks and lets go, and you've got a split in your wood, okay? And I make a lot of these discs for weddings as well, okay? So people that want to have a wedding, and they want to put these wooden discs, they look really great on tables, as holders and stuff. And I always try to do that out of dried wood because if you get if people get wet wood and the wedding's a little ways off, they're all going to have these big splits in them. Now, it's still stable enough that once the split's there, it doesn't matter a lot. It actually gives it character. But what happens is that the denser the wood, usually the more chance of larger splits in the wood. So this wood here is hop hornbeam, okay, or ironwood. And it's very common in the east and north, so in the boreal forest, Acacia forest, where we have upland hardwoods with your sugar maples and your yellow birches, we get a lot of ironwood, and it does grow down in the States. So ironwood is a very dense wood. It's like beech, okay, and it's even more dense than hickory. But it's a diffuse porous wood, which means the vessels are spread out throughout it. But when it dries, and I know this from experience, okay, so here's the end of it, and you can see here, if we put it in the light, there's a split here, okay, there are a check, but this is actually a split. It goes down the wood, and here's another check here. So this is the butt end of the log, and it goes up here about 2 inches, okay. So you can see here that split comes up here and it stops right about here. So if I cut this off, if I cut it off in the bandsaw, which I'll do right now, we'll see how far up the check goes. So bear with me for 2 seconds. Now, the other thing I'll tell you, if you're running a bandsaw and you're cutting something round, okay, when you start feeding that, you want to hold on to that some cotton picking tight, because if the bandsaw grabs that and turns that, it's going to fly right out of your hands, okay? So, I took about a 2-inch piece off of this. Here's our drying checks on the outside. We can see one here very clearly, one here. I've taken off about 2.5 inches, nothing on the inside. See that? So, the good thing about it is, once it dries, and actually let's check the moisture content here as well, because it's likely, as long as it's inside, sometimes when you cut it off, if the wood's not really dry, you'll have high moisture content in here, and you'll get the same thing happen here again. But this wood, okay, 6%, okay, 6% on my dial, which is great. So that means it's stable. So I can cut this off and it's not going to continually check. If I cut that off and it went up to 12, 14, 16% moisture, you better treat this end or it's going to check again. Because there's still, if you're that high in moisture content, up in the double digits, moisture is still going to come out of here and it's going to cause a check in your wood. Now, this end here, same thing. Only the checks here are more substantial. Okay, look at these. Okay, so that is a split. It goes down here quite a ways. Okay, so that's what you want to avoid. Now, there's a lot more to this, and that's why we're doing a video on it. So, checks in wood are they're always going to happen to you. Okay, so when you split out, that's why I cut my handle bolts 36 inches long, because the vast majority of my handles are between 28 and 32 inches long. So when guys order, now I'm doing a couple things, okay? When guys order long handles, okay, number one, you typically don't need a handle over 34 inches, okay? And I have made some 36, 38, actually I made a couple 42, and I've got one hanging right here. Now if you want a long handle, if you want a long handle, I have one. This puppy here, just to show you, okay, and it's hanging here. It's an ash handle. From top to bottom, it is 43 inches long, okay? It's 43 inches. It's got a little bit of a wow in it. Okay, and I think the grain's not bad, okay? But there's a little bit of a wow in that. It's not perfectly straight. It's not bad, but it does need, it is a little bit bent. Anyways, if you want a long handle, I've got one. But that's not it. Actually, over there where that one's hanging, I've got a couple other ones. I might as well talk about these while we're here. But again, that's a great, because that when you start getting long handles, you're gonna start getting bends and bows. It's gonna happen. Okay, it's inevitable. Now I have another one here. That one is straight. Look at that, straight as a die. So that's just a straight handle with a double bit palm swell on the end. If anybody's interested in these, they're right here. This is an ash. It's all 37.5 long. This is a nice, see this, this is the butt, or the palm swell. See, it's it's shaped, okay, on this end. This is the American felling axe pattern, okay? Very pretty one. This is a hickory handle. The other two are ash. And this one here is 37 inches long. Very straight, okay? Okay, so I have three handles here if anybody wants a long handle while we're talking about it. But I digress. So because of that, when people want a long handle, number one, I'm going to be right out at the end of that wood that's dried. So there's going to be checks in the end of the wood. You can't avoid it unless, well, you can if you dry a lot longer piece, okay? But then I wind up wasting a lot of wood. So I may take, if I get a 16-foot log, I will take a bunch of 3-footers, 3, 6, 9, 12, and then that last log, 13, 14, 15, 16, can be 4 feet long, okay? I usually take it out of the butt. And then I will have a few long pieces. So I see a few pieces standing over here that are 4 feet long, okay? There's 2 hickory there and 2 ash that are long, okay? They're at least 44 inches long. And I'll use those for my PV handles, or if I get a special order for a long handle. Now again, the problem with long handles is it's really tough to keep those long handles straight as a die all their life, okay? It's really tough. Because you're making the wood really thin, okay, from what it was. And once you get thin wood that long, and if it leans or does anything, you're going to get some movement in that wood, okay? So a word to the wise: long handles typically bow or bend because they're thin and they're long. Number two, they're going to have checks in the ends of them, okay? On anyone's, okay? It doesn't matter who's drying the wood. If you're going to use that full 36 inches, there's going to be drying checks in the end of that. So I've always tried to tell people that want long handles, if you want a long handle, there's a good chance you're going to have drying checks in the end of it. Now, is that stable and will it stay there? That's the question, okay? Because I have one, and I want to show this to you before I run out of battery here. So, in this order, here is a check. Now, this is a hickory handle, and you can see there's a line running up here, okay? So that's one of those checks in the end of the wood, and it runs up there. But what you want to do to check, is this a problem for me or not? Look at the end. And that lateral check goes in there this far. So what's going to happen is when I work this handle, that's going to disappear. I'm taking it out of there because it's just a drying check. It's not a split, okay? There's a check in the wood. The wood underneath it and all around it's stable. So once I take that out of there, once I shape this handle, it's going to be gone. Okay, now the other thing, and I'm going to get into this because I'm going to have wood here that's not going to be completely dry. Okay, when I get all my hickory and I process it, and I'm going to run it as hickory wood. And I think in my panic I'm doing these videos. But what's going to happen is my wood's going to be dry, so when I bring it in here, it's going to be double digits. And the end's going to be fairly dry, so I may have a few checks out there, and I'm going to cut that off from my 36-inch bowl to make a 34 or 32 or 28-inch handle. But then the end of it is still going to be a lot higher moisture content because the drying hasn't taken the moisture out the whole length of the handle yet. So what I've done and what I do and what you can do to prevent that from checking further, okay? Same as the discs. So all you people that get a Steel Timber Sports disc from a show, this is the key. Salt water will keep it from checking. Okay, so if you have your round disc, mix up some salt water, put your disc in the salt water, and that stabilizes your cells somehow. I'm not sure chemically and physically what's going on, but I'm going to find out. And when you take that out, it will not check. Okay, that big split won't happen in that round cookie. What I do here at home, boiled linseed oil. So once I cut that piece off the end of mine, if you ever get a hickory handle from the East Coast Lumberjack, you'll see there's boiled linseed oil on the end of the handle, on the palm swell end. Now because I put a split, it's just like concrete. When you run a concrete floor and you put those stress marks down the middle, you cut those stress marks in the middle, it'll keep the concrete from splitting, and if it does split, it'll split there. Okay? So the far end has your wedge slot in it. So I typically never get anything happening in that end because I've already got a slot in there to let it give it a little bit of room to move. Most of the issues happen at the palm swell end. So I will always, once I cut my handles off here at the bench and I make a handle shorter, I will put linseed oil on that handle. And sometimes what I've had happen is I make my handles, I put them on the bench, and I don't get back at them for a day or two. And because if I don't put linseed oil on it, it may check right here on the bench. And I come back to make my handle, look at it, go, man, it's checked on me. So all of a sudden I got to go back and make another handle, okay? So I do that here just to prevent any further drying checks from happening on your wood. Now, if it's a drying check, the wood is usually stable around it. It shouldn't go further, which is why I tell people, just drill a little hole, put a wood screw in there to hold that check, and actually if you're not beating on the end of it or causing a lot of physical damage down here to the palm swell, it'll never bother. And I put a lot of those in my splitting balls outside, and of course what happens over time, if your handle's always outside, it's taking on moisture, it's losing moisture. You get a rainy day, it's taking on moisture. You get a dry day, it's losing moisture. And over time, that drying check will increase. It'll keep splitting up the handle because you're not looking after your handle, not because there was actually a problem with it. But on any other axe, if you keep it at relatively the same moisture content and put a screw in there to keep it from anything happening further, that axe will do you the life of the axe handle will do the life of the axe. Okay, so that's a whole lot more on drying checks and splits in the end of handles. Where they come from, when they happen, what caused them to happen, that's moisture when they're drying, how to avoid them, making your bolts a little bit longer than what your handles are going to be, and then work them when they're dry. If you have to work a bolt before it's completely dry, which we do wind up in every now and then, and especially it's going to happen to me because I'm going to run out of hickory wood. When you do that, use some linseed oil or salt water, whatever, on the end of it to keep that from continually drying and getting more checks. Are checks a problem? Not necessarily. Checks are fairly stable, especially if the outside wood around it is dry. Okay, and they shouldn't continue to split unless you abuse your handle. Okay, and if you abuse the handle, if you're like me and you leave your split balls outside, I'm going to put another one in that in 2 years' time anyhow. So, that's wood checks and wood splits 101 for the axe handle experts and those that want to be. That's a little bit of what I've learned over the years with these drying checks. Okay, the last thing I'll say to summarize is long handles are a problem. Okay, and typically we don't need a long handle. Okay, usually you can generate enough power in an axe handle 34 inches long to split your wood. It has a lot more to do with the shape of the axe and what you use and the weight of the axe than it does the actual length of the handle. Now, don't get me wrong, a longer handle can generate a lot more centripetal force, no question at all. It takes you a lot longer to swing it. The other thing I'll say, and I'd like to see comments below, the guys that are using long handles, how often do you miss? Because I know it's a lot. I've swung a handle my whole life, and when I get a longer handle, I do miss. And I know anybody else out there that's honest will say the same thing. So what happens is you wind up beating it up here at the neck of the axe, and you wind up replacing that handle anyhow. So word of the wise, you don't need that long of a handle. So that's what's coming here this week from East Coast Lumberjack. Join us again next week. All kinds more coming.